The envelope was still on the kitchen table when Della Morse came in from the barn at 5:30 in the morning, boots wet to the ankle, hands smelling of iron and hay. She had set it there 3 days ago and had not touched it since. The return address said Monsanto Agricultural Division, St. Louis, Missouri. The postmark said October 14, 2009. And in the upper left corner, in small clean font, were the words, Acquisition Inquiry, Confidential. She filled her coffee cup without looking at it. That envelope. That particular Tuesday in October when everything she had planted, tended, argued over, and been laughed at for, all of it came down to a single question she had not yet let herself answer. Why had she left it sealed for 3 days? And what was it about this particular morning, frost still laced across the south field, the Tamworth sows beginning to stir in their pen, that made her finally reach for it? She did not open it yet. She set her cup down. She pulled on a dry pair of wool socks and walked back to the window. And the field was there, the way it always was. 62 acres of worn-out Tennessee hill ground that everyone from the county extension agent to the man at the First Agricultural Bank of Maury County had told her would never amount to a thing. Not under her management. Not planted the way she planned to plant it. The field was gray in the early light, stubbled now with the dry stalks of the last harvest. But if you knew what to look for, and by October of 2009, Della Morse knew exactly what to look for, you could still see the shape of the rows, could still read the land the way you read a face you had learned over years. She had been reading that face since 1987. Come back to the envelope. We'll come back to it. There is a particular kind of woman the rural South produced in the second half of the 20th century, a woman who learned everything from watching and was told that watching wasn't enough. Who could tell you the nitrogen content of a soil sample by the color and crumble of it in her palm, who had read every land-grant publication she could get her hands on, who had sat in the back of county extension meetings and raised her hand and been passed over, who had filed for her own farm operating loan at the age of 29 and been asked, twice, whether her husband would be co-signing. Della Morse was one of those women. She had a husband once, briefly, and then she didn't, and the farm was hers outright from the moment the ink dried on the settlement. $412 in her checking account, a John Deere 4020 with a cracked manifold, and 62 acres of ground that had been farmed hard for 60 years and given back almost nothing. She knew what the land needed before she knew how to give it. That first autumn, 1987, the October of it, cool and bone-dry, she walked every inch of those 62 acres with a notebook and a borrowed soil probe. She took samples at 16 points. She sent them to the UT Extension Laboratory in Knoxville. The results came back the following week on a Thursday morning, and she spread them on the kitchen table and read them the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Compaction at 8 inches. pH running between 5.1 and 5.4. Organic matter below 1% across the board. Potassium adequate, barely. Phosphorus stripped almost to nothing. The land wasn't sick. The land was exhausted. Her nearest neighbor, Roy Aldecott, was a large man who farmed 300 acres of bottom ground about a mile and a half to her east. He stopped by that first December, ostensibly to see if the fence line along the shared property boundary needed attention, and he stood in her kitchen and looked at the soil reports spread on the table and made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite a laugh but was the cousin of one. I'll tell you what that ground needs. Roy Aldecott picked up one of the reports, scanned it, set it back down. Needs a commercial corn operation with enough fertilizer inputs to wake it up. That's what my daddy would have done with ground like that. Anhydrous, 1717, and then you push it. Della poured him a cup of coffee. That's what the last man who owned it did. For 30 years running. Roy Aldecott drank his coffee. Well. He set the cup on the table. What are you planning, then? She told him. She watched his face while she told him, and she saw the progression of it, the initial polite attention, then the small tightening around his eyes, then the look that men in Maury County gave women who said things that didn't fit the shape of the world as they understood it. She told him she was going to rest half the acreage for 2 full seasons. She was going to plant crimson clover and winter rye as cover crops on the resting ground. She was going to start composting on a scale that nobody in this county had attempted outside of a research station. And she was going to plant the remaining 30 acres in a corn variety that hadn't been commercially grown in Tennessee since the 1940s. Roy Aldecott put his hat back on. "What corn?" "Hickory King," she said. "Open-pollinated. Grows to 10-11 feet. Ear sets high. Tolerates thin ground better than any hybrid I've looked at." Hickory King. He said it the way you say the name of someone who has been dead a long time. Della. "That corn yields maybe 40 bushels to the acre on a good year. My DeKalb hybrid throws 130 without blinking. Your hybrid needs anhydrous and you replace your seed every year." She kept her voice even. "I'm going to save my seed. And I'm going to get 40 bushels from ground that hasn't given anybody anything in a decade. And then next year, I'm going to get 45. Roy Aldecott walked to the door. He was not an unkind man, which was almost worse. His doubt was gentle, almost sympathetic, the way you're gentle with someone who has made a decision you've already watched fail on somebody else. "I'll check that fence line come spring," he said. And he left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck disappear up the gravel drive, and she felt the cold in the glass against her forehead where she leaned it, and she did not let herself wonder whether he was right. The next morning she drove to Nashville to see a man named Wendell Cross, who ran a small seed-saving operation out of a warehouse on Murfreesboro Road that smelled of dry husks and cedar. Wendell Cross was 71 years old and had been saving open-pollinated seeds since before hybrid varieties had captured the Tennessee market entirely. He had Hickory King corn, 12 years of continuous selection, he told her, from a line that traced back to a Madison County farm. He had Jimmy Red Flint corn. He had Tennessee Red Cobb. He kept them in labeled mason jars on shelves that ran floor to ceiling, and he talked about those jars the way a librarian talks about books, each one a specific story, a specific conversation between a farmer and a particular piece of ground over a particular stretch of years. Della bought 6 pounds of Hickory King. She bought 2 pounds of Jimmy Red, which Wendell Cross was almost reluctant to sell her, not because he was withholding but because he wanted to be certain she understood what she was taking on. "That's a corn you got to earn," he told her. "It doesn't perform for a stranger. You got to let it know the land." She told him she understood. She put the jars in a cardboard box on the passenger seat of her truck, and she drove back to Maury County in the dark, and she did not turn on the radio. The first growing season was 1988, and it was not kind. A dry April pushed germination back 3 weeks. The Hickory King came up thin on the east end of the south field, where the compaction was worst, and she lost maybe a third of that stand before the May rains came and gave the survivors something to work with. She cultivated by hand with a wheel hoe for the first 6 weeks because she could not afford to run the tractor over ground she was trying to rebuild. Every pass with iron compacts a little more, and the whole plan was built on the idea of giving the soil back its structure. Her hands blistered. Her back developed a specific kind of ache that lived in the left side below the kidney, a topography of pain she would know for the rest of her life. In July, Earl Timmons from the Maury County Extension Office drove out to look at the operation. Earl was a polite man with a clipboard who had been doing this job for 19 years and genuinely believed he was helping. He walked the rows with her, made notes, asked careful questions. When they got back to the barn he said, "Della, I want to be honest with you. That stand is uneven. Your yield projections, if you're hoping for 40 bushels an acre from this field this year, I think you're going to be disappointed." "What are you projecting?" Earl Timmons looked at his clipboard. 22. "Maybe 25 if August is good to you." She thanked him and he drove away. August was not particularly good to her. The corn made 31 bushels an acre, which was 9 bushels below what she had told Roy Aldecott she'd get, and was also, though nobody said this out loud, 11 bushels per acre better than the extension office had projected, on ground they'd told her was too far gone to be worth the seed cost. She didn't announce this. She put the numbers in her notebook and she saved 14 pounds of the best-formed ears for next year's planting, and she sold the rest at a roadside stand she set up on the highway at the edge of her property. Hickory King dries down to a flour corn. It doesn't taste like the sweet corn people buy from the grocery store. It has a depth to it, a faint nutty quality in the back of the throat. The ears are large and white and handsome, and she priced them at $1 a piece, which seemed absurd to almost everyone who stopped, and then they bought 2 or 3 and came back the following weekend for more. By the end of that first season, she had cleared $1,100 from the roadside stand. The cover crop ground, the 30 acres she had put to rest, greened up spectacularly that fall when the crimson clover came in. She let it stand all winter. Come March of 1989, she mowed it and worked the residue into the top 4 inches with a disc set shallow. The smell of it, that particular green chlorophyll sweetness of freshly turned clover on cold morning soil, was something she would carry the rest of her life as a physical memory, the smell of a bet she was making on the future. Year 2, she planted all 62 acres. Hickory King on the restored ground, Jimmy Red on the experimental plots she had carved out of the north end. She added Kitadine sheep, 15 ewes and a ram she bought from a breeder in Granger County, to graze the field borders and the cover crop rotations, their manure adding to the compost windrows she had built along the east fence. The Kitadines were a hair sheep, a breed that had been developed in Maine but suited herself well to the Tennessee Hill Country because they shed their wool naturally and required almost no parasite management compared to wool breeds. Nobody in Maury County kept Kitadines. Nobody in Maury County had heard of Kitadines, or if they had, they associated the name with somebody else's experiment, not a viable farming choice. She added the Tamworths in 1990. 5 gilts and a boar, a ginger-red breed with long snouts and a constitution built for range, a breed that had been nearly forgotten by commercial hog operations because it didn't marble fast enough for the packers' schedules, but that tasted, when you finally got to the table, like something that remembered what pork was supposed to mean. She ran them in the woodlot on the north end of the farm through the fall, letting them root and forage, supplementing with the cracked Hickory King from the bin. She sold the first litter at 22 weeks to 4 different families within a 30-mile radius, and the second litter went before she'd even weaned them. Word spreads in the particular way it spreads in rural Tennessee, not through advertisement but through someone's kitchen table, through a deacon at a church mentioning a thing to a neighbor, through the gradual accumulation of specific, proven testimony. By 1993, she had a waiting list for Tamworth pork. She had expanded the sheep to 40 head. The Hickory King yield had climbed to 53 bushels per acre on the restored ground, that ground Roy Aldecott had told her would never give a real yield, and the organic matter in her soil, tested each October, had risen from under 1% to 3.4% in 6 years. She retested with the same UT Extension Lab. She drove the samples up herself. A young man named Marcus Webb ran the lab that year. Wendell Cross had given her his name, and he called her on a Friday afternoon when the results were back, and there was something in his voice, a quality of genuine surprise that he was working to contain professionally. "Mrs. Morse, these results, the organic matter on your south field especially, this is unusual. This is the kind of number we see from research plots with 10, 15 years of heavy amendment programs. How long have you been working this ground?" 6 years, she told him. Silence on the line for a moment. "What's your amendment program?" She told him. "Compost from the hog and sheep operation. Green manure from cover crop rotation. No synthetic fertilizer inputs since year 1. No herbicide. Cultivation by steel and attention. I'd like to come out and see it, if you'd allow that." She allowed it. Marcus Webb came out on a Tuesday in late October and spent 4 hours walking the farm with her. He took additional samples. He photographed the compost windrows. He stood in the field and crumbled soil between his fingers, and she watched his face do what faces do when something real has been encountered, a kind of quieting, a settling of the features around an honest recognition. "You know," he said, standing at the edge of the south field in the late afternoon, the light going amber and long across the corn stubble, "the county extension model for ground like this, ground in this condition to begin with, The model says you build organic matter 0.5% per decade under ideal management. You've gone from under 1 to 3.4 in 6 years. She looked at the field. The model doesn't account for the animals, she told him. The manure, the hoof action, the roots from the cover crops going down past the plow layer. They're moving carbon in ways the model doesn't measure. Marcus Webb nodded slowly. He wrote something in his notebook. He would go on to publish a paper about her farm, her methods, her yields, her soil data, in the Tennessee Agricultural Research Journal in 1995. He named the farm. He named the varieties. He did not make a spectacle of it, but the information was there for anyone who wanted to look. Roy Aldecott read it. She knew, because he appeared at her door one morning in March of that year, and there was something different in how he stood at the threshold. The ease of his earlier certainty was gone. He stood there holding a copy of the journal article, folded in half, and he looked at the floor and then at her and then at the floor again. I read this. She waited. I've been noticing your south field. He rubbed the back of his neck. Since last summer I've been watching it. I figured the article might have stretched things. Come see it. She walked him out to the south field and she let the ground speak for itself. The way it gave under the boot. The way it held its structure in the hand rather than powdering or clumping. The earthworm count in a single spade turn, she showed him, counted them aloud, 9 in the first square foot, 12 in the second. Roy Aldecott was a farmer in his bones and he knew what that meant. He stood there in the cold March field and she watched him absorb it and she did not say anything that sounded like winning, because the land wasn't about winning. The land was the point. What do you need? He finally said. Nothing right now. She handed him back his journal. Ask me again in a few years. He did. He asked again in 1998, when he was considering a small pasture rotation for a sheep operation of his own, and she drove over to his place and spent an afternoon walking his ground with him and explaining what she saw and what she thought it wanted. She did not charge him for that afternoon. She brought him a jar of dried hickory king from her seed bin, the 1997 selection, and told him how to plant it. Meanwhile the word was spreading in directions she had not anticipated. A food writer from Nashville came out in 1999 and wrote a piece for the Scene about Tamworth pork and heritage corn. A chef from Memphis drove up in 2001 and left with a side of pork and 8 pounds of hickory king cornmeal that she was now stone grinding herself on a small mill she had bought from an estate sale in Cookeville. By 2003 she was selling cornmeal, not just dried corn, but milled meal, stone ground, labeled with the variety name and the harvest year and the farm name, Morse Hill Farm, Maury County, Tennessee, to 6 restaurants in Nashville and 2 in Knoxville and 1 in Atlanta. The Jimmy Red, the experimental variety she'd started with a 2-pound jar from Wendell Cross, had become something of its own by now. She had been selecting seed from it for 15 years, saving always from the earliest maturing, most vigorous plants, and the line she had by 2003 was not precisely the same corn that Wendell Cross had given her. The ground had altered it. Her selection had pushed it. The ears were a darker red, the kernels broader, the dry down faster. She had begun selling Jimmy Red cornmeal separately, at a premium, to 3 restaurants that treated it the way a wine buyer treats a single vineyard vintage. She was 44 years old and she had not become wealthy. But she had built something. She had built something in the soil first and then in the community of people who had come to know what the soil was doing, and there was a quality to that building that she recognized as permanent in a way that a bank account is never permanent. The soil tests told the story year by year: organic matter at 4.1% in 2000, 4.8% in 2003. The compaction at the 8-inch layer had essentially resolved. Earthworm counts that Marcus Webb, who visited every other year now, called among the highest he'd measured on non-certified organic farmland in Tennessee. She applied for USDA organic certification in 2002 and received it in 2003 for all 62 acres and the associated livestock and grain operations. The certification added a dimension to the story she told at farmers markets and to restaurant buyers, but she found that the people who already knew the farm didn't need the certification to believe in it. The certification was for new people, for the strangers who needed a third party to vouch for what the soil itself was already saying. In 2004, she added Ossabaw Island hogs. A small island off the Georgia coast had been home to a feral population of Spanish heritage hogs since the 16th century, descended from pigs left by Spanish explorers, and the breed had developed an extraordinary capacity to store fat efficiently, an adaptation to periods of abundance and scarcity on the island. A conservation breeding program had made breeding stock available to farms willing to keep detailed records and contribute to the genetic preservation effort. Della applied. She received 4 gilts in February of 2004, small, dark-bristled animals with long snouts and a self-possessed, almost watchful quality, nothing like the placid commercial breeds. She ran the Ossabaws separately from the Tamworths, on a woodlet rotation on the south boundary of the farm where there were white oaks that masted heavily every 2 or 3 years. In a mast year, those pigs worked the ground under the oaks like a slow, thorough harrow, eating acorns with a deliberate, methodical pleasure, putting on a fat that when rendered was golden and tasted faintly of the trees. She sold Ossabaw lard, she called it Morse Hill mast lard on the label, beginning in the fall of 2005 and sold out within a week of the first production. The jar of Ossabaw lard was the thing her daughter couldn't stop laughing about. Not meanly, Corinne Morse was 20 years old and studying food science at UT Knoxville, and her laughter was the warm, admiring kind. "Mama," Corinne said, standing in the farm kitchen that Thanksgiving, holding a jar of the golden fat up to the window light. "You have a waiting list for lard." She said it like she was announcing a miracle, which in some ways she was. But things were changing around the farm in ways that Della had been watching with attention since about 2002. The landscape of seeds in America was shifting in a direction she had understood abstractly for years but was now seeing concretely in the county around her. Hybrid varieties she'd watched her neighbors plant were being replaced by proprietary varieties, patented genetics, seeds you could not legally save, seeds you bought back every single year from the same company at a price that was set by people who had never put a hand in the ground. The Monsanto Roundup Ready corn system had taken over most of the commercial acreage in Maury County by 2005. She would drive the road past Roy Aldecott's bottom ground and see the yellow-green uniformity of it, every plant identical to its neighbor, the field floor weed-free in a way that looked chemical and final, and she would think about what lay beneath that surface, the biology, the fungal networks, the earthworm populations, and she would feel a slow, quiet dread. Roy Aldecott had switched most of his acreage to Roundup Ready by 2004. He had not switched entirely, in part because she had given him Hickory King seed in 1998 and he'd kept a small plot going, a private act of preservation she respected. But the economics of it were what they were. The extension agents, who now carried Monsanto brochures alongside their university publications, told every farmer in the county that Roundup Ready was the future. The farm supply stores organized their shelf space accordingly. She kept saving seed. By 2007, she had been saving seed continuously for 20 years. 20 years of selection from the same founding population of Hickory King, 20 years of Jimmy Red, a decade and a half of a Tennessee Red Cobb variety she had found in a church basement in Columbia in 1994 through a connection that Wendell Cross, who had died in 2001, at 83, with his seed jars catalogued and donated to Vanderbilt's biological collections, had established before he passed. She had documented every generation. She had germination records, planting records, selection records. She had photographs of ear development from every harvest year. She had, in other words, something that no laboratory in the country could replicate quickly, 20 years of adapted genetics, 20 years of a particular corn learning a particular piece of Tennessee Hill ground. And the people who understood that had been noticing. A seed library in Asheville had contacted her in 2006 requesting samples for preservation. A graduate student from Vanderbilt had spent a summer on the farm in 2007 documenting her selection practices and had told her, carefully, that the genetic divergence between her current Jimmy Red line and the original population Wendell Cross had maintained was substantial, that her farm had essentially developed a distinct landrace, a variety shaped by a specific place over enough generations to have its own character. She had sat with that information for a long time. The graduate student's name was Priya Anand, and she had come back to the farm twice since her research summer, each time bringing news from the academic world of crop genetics that made Della's hands still in her lap as she listened. Companies were beginning to patent landrace varieties. There was a process, she explained it carefully, through which a corporation could file patents not just on transgenic modifications but on conventional varieties identified through genetic surveying. If a company surveyed a variety and filed before the original maintainer did, the legal ground became treacherous. Della had not filed anything. She had not filed because the idea of owning a seed in the legal sense felt wrong to her in a way she struggled to put in language. A seed was not property in the way a tractor was property. A seed was an ongoing conversation between a farmer and a piece of ground and a strand of life older than either of them. She had been the custodian of that conversation for 20 years. She had given freely, seed packets to neighbors, samples to libraries, germplasm to the Vanderbilt collection, and the giving was part of what it meant. But Priya Anand's concern stayed with her. And in September of 2009, a researcher named Holloway at the University of Georgia published a brief genomic survey of Southern heritage corn varieties that included a profile of a variety he designated TNJRMH09, Tennessee Jimmy Red, Morse Hill selection. He had used, with her permission, germplasm from the Vanderbilt collection. The designation made her farm and her selection work part of the formal scientific record. 3 weeks later, the envelope arrived. Monsanto Agricultural Division, St. Louis, Missouri. October 14, 2009. She had set it on the kitchen table and she had not touched it for 3 days, and now it was October 17, a Friday morning, frost on the south field, the Tamworth sows beginning their dawn conversation in the pen, and she was standing at the kitchen window with her second cup of coffee, and she could not put it off any longer. She set the cup down. She picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, the kind of paper that communicates seriousness by its own weight. She ran her thumb under the flap and drew out 2 pages, folded in thirds, typed in a clean sans serif font. The letter was from a man named Richard Aldecott, who held the title of Director of Germplasm Acquisition. It opened with a paragraph of what she recognized as careful corporate courtesy, an acknowledgement of the Holloway Genomic Survey, a reference to her farm's documented history, a genuine-sounding expression of admiration for 20 years of selection work. Then it moved, in the second paragraph, to the thing it was actually saying. Monsanto was interested in the Jimmy Red Morse Hill selection. They were interested in the genetic profile of the corn, specifically a cluster of traits related to early dry-down and disease resistance that the Holloway survey had flagged. They were proposing, the letter said, an acquisition inquiry, meaning they wanted to begin a conversation about purchasing the rights to the germplasm and the selection records. The figure mentioned in the third paragraph, stated as a preliminary offer subject to negotiation, was $240,000. She read it twice. She set it down on the table. She picked up her coffee cup and stood at the window again and looked at the south field, at the dry stalks of the last Hickory King harvest standing in the October light, and she thought about Wendell Cross standing in his warehouse on Murfreesboro Road with his jars on their shelves, talking about each seed as a story. She thought about the day she had crouched in the north plot and pulled the first Jimmy Red ear in 1989, the dark red of it, the surprise of that color in her hands. She thought about Priya Anand sitting at this same table explaining patent law, and the graduate student's hands moving when she talked, the earnestness of her concern. And she thought about what $240,000 would mean to this farm. The aging tractor. The barn roof that had needed replacing for 3 seasons. The seed storage facility she had been designing on paper for 2 years and had not built because the capital wasn't there. She thought about it for a long time. Then she went out to the barn and fed the Tamworths, and the Kitadines, and the 4 Ossabaw sows who watched her come through the gate with the particular calm, measuring intelligence that had characterized the breed for 500 years of making their own way in the world. She came back in at 7:30 and sat down at the table and wrote a response. She wrote it by hand, on her own paper, and she wrote slowly. She thanked Mr. Richard Aldecott for his letter and for the straightforwardness of his approach. She acknowledged that the offer was serious and that she had given it serious consideration. And then she told him, in the specific and practical terms she preferred to abstract ones, why she could not accept it. The Jimmy Red Morse Hill selection, she wrote, was not simply a product. It was the accumulated result of a specific farm's relationship with a specific piece of ground over 20 years. The traits that interested Monsanto, the early dry down, the disease tolerance, were expressions of that relationship. They had been shaped by the particular clay loam soil of Maury County, by the specific rainfall patterns of Middle Tennessee, by 20 years of selection decisions made by a woman who had been walking those fields since 1987 and who understood the ground the way you understand a face you have looked at long and carefully. Remove the genetics from that context, select for those traits in isolation, propagate them under different conditions with different aims, and the conversation would end. You would have data. You would not have a variety. Furthermore, she wrote, the seed had not been produced alone. It had come originally from Wendell Cross, whose own line traced to a Madison County farm. The Vanderbilt collection held germplasm freely donated. Priya Anand had contributed documentation. This was a commons, not a property, and she did not have the right to sell what was not hers alone to sell. And finally, she wrote, she had spent 20 years demonstrating that this farm, this particular arrangement of soil, animals, open-pollinated genetics, and hand labor, was viable. That it was more than viable. That ground everyone had told her was exhausted and finished had become, through a specific and documented set of practices, among the most fertile farmland in the county. She had spent 20 years proving that the answer to the crisis of the American farm was not more consolidation, more chemical dependency, more patented genetics. She had no intention of selling that proof to the entity that most profited from the crisis she had spent her life working against. She signed it. She folded it. She put it in an envelope. She drove to the post office in Columbia at 8:15 and mailed it, and on the way back she stopped at the farm supply and picked up the fencing supplies she had been meaning to get for 2 weeks, and she drove back to the farm in the October morning with the heater running and the light coming across the fields flat and golden the way October light does in Tennessee, and she felt, in the bones of her hands on the steering wheel, something that was not triumph exactly. Triumph was too loud for what this was, but was the quiet, specific satisfaction of a person who has remained exactly who they are in the face of the most persuasive argument in the world for becoming something else. Richard Aldous wrote back 3 weeks later, November 6, 2009. A shorter letter, also on heavy cream paper. He thanked her for the clarity of her response and said that he respected her position. He mentioned, in the final paragraph, that Monsanto maintained an interest in heritage variety preservation and would be in touch if the nature of their interest changed. It was the kind of letter that a large organization writes when it wants to leave a door open without admitting the door had been closed. She put his letter in the folder where she kept the first one. She added both letters to the Farm Records archive, in the section she had labeled Legal and Correspondence, between the 2008 soil test results and the 2010 seed inventory. Priya Anand, when Della called her that evening, was quiet for a long moment after hearing it. You turned down $240,000. It wasn't mine to take. Another quiet moment. Then, do you need anything? For the farm? The barn roof has needed doing for 3 years. Priya Anand drove up from Nashville that Saturday with a friend who did construction work, a man named Dale Birch who had a truck full of metal roofing and an apparent willingness to spend a weekend in Maury County. She did not explain where Dale Birch had come from or what arrangement had been made. She simply arrived and they worked, and by Sunday evening the south barn had a new roof, and Della fed them both dinner, and Priya sat at the kitchen table and looked at the 2 Monsanto letters that Della had left out and didn't say anything for a long time. You know they'll go find another Jimmy Red line, Priya finally said. I know. Della set a plate of cornbread on the table, made from this year's Jimmy Red meal, dark and coarse-grained and smelling of the particular depth that 20 years of selection had built into it. But they won't find this one. Priya broke off a piece of the cornbread and ate it, and her eyes did something quiet and private, the way eyes do when a body recognizes something true. No, she said. They won't find this one. The year 2010 opened cold, a January that cracked the water lines in the old farmhouse twice and kept the citadines in the shelter barn for 3 weeks straight. But by March the ground was workable and she was in the fields, the same fields she had first walked with a soil probe in October of 1987, and the soil under her boots was not the same soil that had been there then. The difference was measurable, she had measured it, every October, for 23 years, but it was also something you could feel, something that communicated itself through the soles of your feet the way all true things communicate, beneath language, below argument, in the register of direct encounter. She planted Hickory King on the south field the second week of April, the same variety, the same line of selection, the 23rd generation from those first 6 pounds she had carried home from Wendell Cross in a cardboard box on a cold December night. She planted Jimmy Red on the north plots. She let the Tamworths into the east pasture rotation and the Ossabaws into the south woodlet where the white oaks were beginning their alternate year mast cycle. Roy Aldecott drove over in late April to borrow a chain and stayed for 2 hours, and they walked the field borders together and talked about a cover crop mix he was trying on a degraded slope on his property, and she recommended a combination of hairy vetch and cereal rye that she had been using on similar ground since 2005. He listened carefully, the way he listened now, which was different from the way he had listened in her kitchen in 1987, that earlier listening had been indulgent, patient, the listening of a man waiting for a woman to finish so he could explain the real situation. This was the listening of someone who had watched something real happen over 20 years and had revised himself accordingly, which is not an easy thing for any person to do and is worth acknowledging when it happens. You hear anything more from those company people? He meant Monsanto. Word had gotten around, not through her, but through the way word moves in a rural county, through Priya's friend Dale Birch probably, or through the feed store, or through the simple fact that in a small community, secrets are mostly just slow news. 1 letter. Then nothing. Roy kicked at the soil at the field edge, the loose, crumbly, dark-colored soil that had been gray clay hardpan 23 years ago. He picked up a handful and let it fall through his fingers. Good, he said. She walked back to the house in the April afternoon, the light still sharp and cool, the peach tree by the south corner of the house beginning its slow pink extravagance, and she went into the kitchen and washed her hands at the sink and looked at the kitchen table where, for 3 days in October of 2009, a cream-colored envelope had sat untouched. The table was empty now. A bowl of dried Jimmy Red ears sat in the center of it, each ear a deep, rust red, the kernels tight and ordered and specific as a text in a language she had spent her adult life learning to read. She had not become wealthy. She had not become famous, not in the way the word is usually used. She had not beaten anyone, exactly, or been vindicated in the loud public way that the word vindication sometimes suggests, no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement from the county extension office, no letter of apology from Richard Aldous at Monsanto. What had happened was quieter and more permanent than any of those things. The soil had a 4.9% organic matter reading in the fall of 2009, the last test before the Monsanto letter arrived. 22 years from under 1% to 4.9. The earthworm count in her south field was the highest Marcus Webb had ever recorded outside a managed biodynamic research station in his career. The Jimmy Red Morse Hill selection was registered in the Vanderbilt Genomic Archive, in the Asheville Seed Library, and in the hands of 11 other farmers across 4 states who were carrying it forward in their own ground, beginning their own long conversations with it. The Hickory King corn she had first planted from Wendell Cross's jar in the spring of 1988 was still growing in this ground. Still being selected, still being saved. Still learning the place. 23 years of it. That was not nothing.